Well, hello, here I am in Kuala Lumpur. As you can see behind me, some of the very many skyscrapers that they have here. Some beautiful architecture. Similarly, you can see the skyscrapers behind me, but also some of the greenery that's immersed within the city. It's very beautiful. I'm not here to discuss Malaysian insolvency procedures, although of course they do have insolvency procedures. Here are their personal provisions regulating the insolvency of individuals, and then here are their new but as yet not in force corporate provisions regulating the insolvency of juristic persons, of companies. But what I do want to talk to you about is the set text for Law 373, our corporate insolvency law course, and the set text is of course this. It's Professor Finch, Vanessa Finch's 2009 second edition Cambridge University Press book, which is of course entitled Corporate Insolvency Law. It is 2009. Some of you may think, well, hang on, it's 2017. Why are we using a book that's so old? Technically, there are no real competitors in a certain sense. There is actually a new edition of this book underway. The 2009 edition will be replaced sometime this year, I'm told, by Professor Millman, by the third edition. And the reason there's been some delay, Professor Finch has retired. Vanessa was a professor at the London School of Economics for most of her career, in fact, as she went up the hierarchy there from lectureship up to a chair at the LSE. She's retired a couple of years ago from teaching, but she is still writing, and of course she's taken on board Professor Millman as her co-author. So David's busy now in Lancaster writing away to get that third edition out, but until that's out, we're left excuse me, with the second edition. There is a competitor text. If you don't like the writing style, I'll come on to explain why we select and use this as our set text in due course. But first I'll address competitor texts. There are two that you could have a look at. There's the fourth edition of Professor Sir Roy Good QC's Corporate Insolvency Law, which is a Sweet and Maxwell book. So obviously an excellent book by the doyen of commercial law, Professor Good. There's a practitioner's version available, about £250, but there is a student version, which I think is about £35 roughly. So do have a look at that as well. There are copies in the library that you can have a look at for Professor Good's treatment of the various areas of corporate insolvency that we'll look at. There is also another text, which is Professor Key. He's at Leeds, of course Roy Good, who I've just mentioned, Sir Roy, he's at Oxford, he's emeritus there. But Professor Key, Andrew Key, K-E-A-Y, and Professor Walton, they have also published a book, but their book is a mix of both personal insolvency law and corporate insolvency law. It's published by Jordan's, and I think it's in its second edition at the moment. Professor Good has a new edition underway, so his fifth edition will be coming out, I think, in the next year, according to the publisher's website. So you can have a look at Key and Walton. It's absolutely an erudite piece of work. It's slightly old, like most of the texts in our area, but because half the book deals with personal insolvency, it's not as relevant to our course as the two main tomes, that's to say Finch and Good. Interestingly, there's quite a core of insolvency scholars in Nottingham. So at the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University, there's sort of 6 people or so clustered around that city who are interested in insolvency, and one individual who's left Nottingham Trent and is now in Chicago, based at the Illinois Institute of Technology, Adrian Walters. He, along with David Burdett of Nottingham Trent, Sandra Frisby and Irit Meverach of not the University of Nottingham, they've co-authored a book on corporate insolvency law, and it's going to be published by the Oxford University Press. Apparently, although I've been speaking to some of those individuals and their colleagues, and it seems that that book may have stalled, so I'm not sure if that will ever come out under the auspices of those authors, or if other authors may come on board and finish off that project. But that's interesting to note that that may come out. Let's have a look. I'll let you know via our various media outlets that we use, so Twitter or just some of these podcasts that we'll be doing, what the state of play is on the OUP book. But back to our set text. Why are we going to use this text? Well, it's an excellent book, as you'd expect, by a professor from the London School of Economics, Professor Finch. It's of course a black letter book in a certain sense, and it deals with the minutiae of the law and the provisions that govern our subject of corporate insolvency law. But also it's a book that pushes the boundaries of our subject, which is why we need to look at it, because we want to be critical of our subject and hopefully attack and discuss some of the minutiae that there is. So Finch is very good. She looks at the core provisions, but similarly she also looks at lots of secondary sources to help us get informed about the literature that's out there around concepts that touch on insolvency. For example, pari passu distribution, a treatment of that concept, and all of the academic commentators who've mulled on what is pari passu distribution, equality of distribution. She undertakes a very thorough examination of that. And indeed, her book, as well as being immersed in the black letter law, immersed in the secondary sources, she also uses 4 measures, 4 benchmarks throughout her book to look at each individual area. And for our course, as you will see from my introductory lecture, we will use her measures of insolvency law as we progress through the course, but we will also use 2 of my own measures that are different to those which Professor Finch promulgates in a book. We will use my timeline of insolvency, see the Prezi on the front page of our module area on Vital for that timeline of insolvency. So we'll use the idea of how the procedures sit and how they can be used perhaps differently in terms of time during the currency of an insolvency. And similarly, we'll use my waterfall idea of insolvency as well. Again, see the Prezi on the front page of Vital for our module, Law 373. But Finch's book, she, as I've said, has 4 measures or benchmarks of insolvency, which we'll also use. And these measures are, of course, efficiency, expertise, accountability, and fairness. So let's have a brief look at those, or let's briefly think about those and why they're important. So the first one is efficiency. The first edition of her book came in for a strong critique by Professor Mukal in a review that he did in the Modern Law Review, which is the LSE's journal, as you know, and the piece was entitled On Efficiency. Professor Mukal is now a tenant at 34 South Square, but before that he was a professor at the UCL, so he read the first edition of Professor Finch's book, had remembered his undergraduate studies as an economist, which was what his first degree was, and basically critiqued heavily her use of efficiency. He said that she used different types of efficiency as she progressed through that first edition. But of course, in her way, in the way in which she was deploying efficiency, she was trying to look at how efficient an insolvency regime is. And we'll similarly use that measure and see how she uses it. The second edition did address Professor Mukal's comments, and you can see in the literature in the book, but also in other exchanges between the two, that both Professor Mukal Riz and Professor Finch have have debated a number of issues between themselves in rather strong terms, which is interesting to see. So it's real robust scholarship against each other there. But efficiency then is the first one. How efficient is a regime, and could it be made more efficient through various methods? The second measure, of course, then is expertise. In 1986, when the Insolvency Act was first promulgated, as this huge reforming statute, we'll discuss this in lecture 2, insolvency practitioners, the main people who run the systems that we're talking about, were first introduced as individuals who required a professional qualification, because hitherto, up until 1996, there was no formal qualification that was needed. So we had a phenomenon called, or known as, cowboy liquidators, for example. So you'd have people appointing their friends as liquidators, because no formal qualifications were needed, who would then ride a coach and horses through the various stakeholder interests and benefit their friends, the directors, with their activity. This is obviously bad, and that's why the Cork report looked at the idea of professionalisation. So that's why Finch uses expertise as a measure to see how that may or may not, this idea of experts and expertise within insolvency, help the system. Whether or not the third edition will reflect Michael Gove's attack on experts, we'll wait to see what Millman and Finch come up with. Well, the next measure is accountability. So accountability to secured creditors and other stakeholders, so directors, unsecured creditors, society, the environment, etc. To whom is an insolvency law accountable, and why is that next measure? And therefore, how do the different procedures that Professor Finch looks at talk to that measure, accountability? And finally, fairness, which arguably, for insolvency, when you're dealing with a finite pool of resources that needs to be distributed, fairness as a measure is incredibly important. And as you'll see from my own critical tool, that's to say the insolvency waterfall, which shows that the hierarchy of distribution is stratified to the extent of being arguably unfair, secured creditors at the top, unsecured creditors at the bottom. How is that fair? How does that waterfall accord with notions of equality of distribution, of pari passu distribution? Is it fair? Well, of course, if you're an unsecured creditor receiving 0 pence in the pound, you would say no, it isn't. If you're a secured creditor, you would say it is, because you were sufficiently astute to gain security to get that priority in the waterfall. So those 4 measures then that Professor Finch uses that I've referred to, so that's to say efficiency, expertise, accountability and fairness, are tools that we'll look at as we progress through the course and the set text, Professor Finch's set text here, which we will all become deeply, deeply connected with and knowledgeable upon. Those measures are my own measures that I've mentioned, or approaches, that's to say the timeline of insolvency, and the insolvency waterfall will also be used in a critical way to examine the subject that we're now going to look at. So please do get hold of the set text and do become deeply familiar with it. Get reading it as soon as you can and read it for every seminar that we're going to be doing. And I think you'll enjoy it. As I've said, if you prefer the writing style of Professor Good, go and have a look at his book. It's rather good. Sorry about that. And also you can have a look perhaps at some practitioners' texts. My own PhD supervisor, Professor Fletcher, he has the 4th edition of his The Law of Corporate Insolvency, which is half personal, half corporate, but it's rather expensive. It's nearly £300, I think. He's currently writing the 5th edition. So do have a look at the 4th, but perhaps don't buy it. There's copies in the library. It's very expensive, as I've said, and there's a new edition forthcoming. So don't use your money on that, otherwise you'll need the contents of the book that relate to personal insolvency. If you've got any questions whatsoever about any books, insolvency books, or you see any rare insolvency books in bookshops, do let me know. I will come to an arrangement with you in terms of acquisition of those books. And hopefully enjoy the materials, the set texts and all the other books that you're going to be looking at. So from here in Kuala Lumpur, on this sunny day, I will bid you goodbye, and I'll see you soon to discuss the materials that we've just very briefly gone over. So from here, goodbye.